Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. We are continuing our cycle of public events dedicated to the coming world exhibition and its game club. And I'd like to introduce Jose Sanchez, the creator of Blockhood and other games and the creator of the Plethora project. There will be Q&A after the lecture. So, you're welcome.
Hi, Irina. Thanks so much for Garage for having me, for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be able to travel and share with you the ideas of my work. So hopefully I can unpack some of those ideas today in this presentation. I'm going to break this talk into 4 different parts. So hopefully we can just start with some of the motivations, and then that would lead towards the actual work. I'm a Chilean architect. I was born during the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet in 1980. And this dictatorship, as you might know, it was kind of a test bed, an experimental setting for a new form of politics and economics, in particular, a form of neoliberalism that was exported or imported from the School of Chicago. Someone like Milton Friedman had a series of students in Chicago that became the Chicago Boys in Santiago that imported some of those ideas into the country. Some of those ideas really kind of took off. What we today call neoliberalism, as it was exported to the US and the UK with Reagan and Thatcher. It's something that in many ways people argue started in this kind of Chilean setting. I just want to create a kind of a foundation of my own understanding of neoliberalism in the sense of this kind of, as Paul Mason would describe it, as having this kind of two-coin situation where on the one hand you have incredible success or kind of the reduction of prices and proliferation of progress, if you want. But on the other side of the coin, there seems to be kind of a much darker side that has to do with sweatshops and precarious forms of labor. What this kind of model seems to be creating, as many have argued, is a kind of a winner-takes-all society, one that with great amount of inequality. As an architect, I've been detecting and obviously critical of how this practice of economics has also influenced the field, and has influenced the field way before we have this economic system. This is the Guggenheim of Helsinki competition. In architecture, is very familiar. I don't know if you are all architects, but it's very familiar to engage with architectural competitions. An architectural competition, you basically work for free and you submit an entry. And usually you have hundreds or even thousands of entries, out of which you have one winner that would basically develop the project, if that project is effectively produced at all. And so architecture seems to me that has created these forms of heroes. People like Frank Gehry, for instance, in this case, had created a form of relationship with a client, in this case, Peter Lewis, who is someone that was a great benefactor or philanthropist that was supporting Frank Gehry on his development, who spent millions of dollars in the development of a residence, the unbuilt Lewis residence that we can see on the right. And it's unlikely that we architects can get to work with clients like this ones, or put it more statistically, there's not enough clients like this one to sustain this form of practice of architecture or design, I would argue. So people like Ross Perlin would estimate that there's over 2 billion annual subsidies that happen in corporate America that comes from unpaid and underpaid internships. And this is very much a similar situation that architecture is going through. Today, Chile, it's in huge protests. We have, after 30 years since the dictatorship ended, Chile is going to the streets because the model, some would say, has failed. It has created a great amount of inequality and people are not taking it any further. I was studying and graduated from my studies just at the 2008 financial crisis. So I belong to a generation that started to work just after that crisis came about. And it really has influenced my thinking and the ideas that I put behind my work. One of the first contradictions that I kind of observed is that we have been equating progressive or avant-garde architecture that seems to be synonymous to regressive social practices, meaning underpaid or unpaid internships and forms of exploitation. And I think that that doesn't need to be the case. Perhaps we should challenge that model. Someone that has been very influential for me is Buckminster Fuller, and he coined the term ephemeralization, which is a difficult word of saying we can do more with less. So technology can allow us to do more efficient things with less materials, with less ingredients. But I would argue that that idea has failed in some degree, because ephemeralization has indeed allowed to do more with less, so that has worked, but it has been able to create a lot more inequality. So it's creating larger margins of profit as opposed to kind of the prosperity that Buckminster Fuller was hoping that would happen. So can we develop an architectural and design agenda that incorporates metrics of social progress? And that's ultimately the question that I want to ask. How do we design systems that reduce the barrier of entry, that incorporate local value production, and so on? So in 2011, I started teaching, and one of the first intuitions regarding my own personal work was really to put everything online, to start documenting everything what I was doing. So in a funny way, I became a YouTuber, or at that time, Vimeo was my platform of choice. And I started developing content, in this case, teaching people how to code, how to program, kind of sharing open source code. And it really kind of started becoming the ethos behind my design studio. How do you share? How do you propagate knowledge? And I realized that many times as an architect, the content that I was putting out there, this is an exhibition, a dance performance piece that was done by a group of people I didn't know, started using the material I was putting forward, and it never kind of was exactly what I was expecting. There was always kind of appropriation and distortion and I celebrate that. I thought that was beautiful. That's something interesting, that the content that you're putting out there was appropriated in a very specific way. So with that in mind, I kind of set to design a series of projects, and I really take a lot of time in developing a project. Usually there's several years between each project of development to get to the point in which I think they're ready. So I'm going to go through maybe 3 or 4 projects, but I'm going to break them down in 3 chapters. And the first one has to do with an argument about parts and a kind of a reflection on the relation between the parts and the whole. We seem to be, at least in design and architecture, we seem to be moving away from a paradigm of assembly, right? Mechanical assemblies. In architecture, we are celebrating these days a lot what I call the dissolution of tectonics, right? We have people like Greg Lynn that are working with fiber placement, Neri Oxman with beautiful 3D printing, or Zaha Hadid, which is kind of differentiating also through 3D printing, different intensities. But with that comes the necessity, you remove the necessity of parts, right? What also happens is that when we start engaging with things like optimization, we want parts to be more efficient, we are able to connect many parts together. And this is a technique called topological optimization, where you're able to meld and connect parts into one larger unit that performs more efficiently and perhaps use less material. This is actually happening at a larger scale. This is the development of a rocket engine. And this is a company called Relativity that they show their statistics. You can see that it's a lot cheaper. It's a lot faster, and it reduces a great deal the number of components. You can see on the right, they can calculate that the amount of components they need for developing an engine is way less. So parts seem to be coalescing, they seem to be connected into one larger unit. And this is the foundation of what we understand today in a production chain as a vertical integration, right? So a factory, a company is able to buy all the pieces of the production chain, internalize those parts into a larger whole, right? So the company owns everything throughout the supply chain. And this has brings a lot of power to that company. It brings a lot of optimization opportunities, sure, but it comes also, you're kind of disrupting what before used to be done by a whole town, by a whole village, or a series of suppliers across the different places in the world. Today are centralized in one big factory. In architecture, this is also happening. The company that seems to be leading these initiatives is called Katerra. And Katerra, it's a kind of it's a company that is working a lot with automation and vertical integration as a technique to deliver homes. And the problem that I see with this model, again, going back to the ideas of Buckminster Fuller, has to do that Katerra is creating a product that is not increasing in any way the quality of life of individuals, but rather is selling a product that has better margins, right? This is how they sell it, and you can look at it online. The way they sell their product has better margins, right? So people were increasing inequality, increasing profits for a particular group, but we're not definitely, technology is not increasing quality of life. So I wonder if certain techniques, what I would call parametric or we've been seeing, or non-standard, continuous forms of architecture, all this technological development seems to not work in some capacity, doesn't really reach the public, because trickle-down, which is the techniques that they are using, doesn't seem to work. What else is out there? How can we design an alternative? And I've been part of a generation, a group of people, maybe a collective, you could say, that we've been putting forward the idea of discrete architecture. And the idea of discrete architecture is return to an idea of parts. Parts are important again, and because they have a social role, and they afford the interaction of users and the production of value and patterns by users in many different ways. So this is how I kind of picture this framework of discrete design and social participation. So in this image, we see a background of Lego pieces, right? Thousands of Lego pieces. And then you have a social system that sits on top of that. And some of these people are working together. Some of them are working, as a group, or some of them are working individually. And they're all creating patterns, assemblies of Legos that some of them perhaps are not so interesting. Some of them might be great and beautiful, and who knows. And some of them might be copying each other, right? They're kind of learning from each other. So there's kind of a constant proliferation of new codes or new value systems that emerge out of this foundation. So this image shows three things, right? There's parts, there's like building blocks, right? Patterns, arrangements that are information, basically arrangements that seem to allow for a particular meaning or value. And then there's the idea of the commons, right, which is a infrastructure, or kind of a repository of possible parts that we can combine in different ways. So this is a framework that I want to work with. This is a framework that it's important for me because it really enables people to develop content and value for themselves. So parts, patterns, commons. This model, I would say, it's challenged today by what I described before: vertical integration, the dissolution of parts, certain technologies like 3D printing that are disrupting the production chain. Today are kind of putting a lot of, they're really challenging the possibility of having socially enabled systems. So there's been great examples of this social production, especially in the world of open source, examples like in the Linux project or Wikipedia. But in architecture, some of these ideas is something that I really wanted to test and put it into practice. So I developed a project together with a colleague of mine, Alisa Andrzejczyk. It's the first project that we really tried to implement some of these ideas into design, right? So this is a video that shows you how the project Bloom really started. Bloom is it's an interactive installation developed for the London Olympics in 2012. And it started with the idea that we could imagine a unit, something like a piece or like a building block, something like a Lego unit, if you want, that you could simulate its growth. You could simulate how it actually would expand as a system. But at the same time, we were thinking of it as a toy. We were thinking of it as something that people would manipulate, change, almost an act of gardening, if you want. So as you can see here, what I'm showing you is almost the design process behind the project. But this form of computation, this form of simulation was very deterministic, was very straightforward. You could move sliders around and you would actually get a specific result. And it wasn't messy, it wasn't spontaneous, it wasn't unexpected, right? So as much as we were interested in simulating the system, what the system could do, I was far more interested in what the people would do with the project, right? How people would kind of appropriate it and take it into their own hands. So I'm showing you the iteration that we had over the different pieces. In this case, we were trying to develop one unit, one single unit that would be multiplied or created thousands of times in order for people to connect them, organize them, arrange them in many different ways. So the Bloom project was presented for the London Olympics, but also for the Paralympics. And it really starts by an aggregation that we as architects, designers put together, but then it's really open up for the crowd to play with. Something that hopefully goes beyond our initial expectations. And truly, like for the many weeks and months where this project was exhibited, many different configurations that we didn't expect emerge out of the process of playing with the crowd, participating. Some people would be really good at destroying things, and some people would be very good at creating things. So there was this kind of constant push and pull, depending on the crowds, depending on the time of the day. People might be more creative or more destructive. And in that extent, it really became this act of gardening, right? Like as we were initially intending. There was sometimes the system would grow, and sometimes the system would just kind of be reduced and packaged, right? So I was very curious to allow these kind of interactions, these kind of messy, unexpected interactions to be part of a design process where, yes, there is an input as an architect of something that triggers an interaction, right? It triggers a kind of a form of participation, but at the same time, there's a whole series of value systems and idiosyncratic ideas that are coming from the crowd that cannot be anticipated. They couldn't be forecasted. This project was working with the idea of injection molding. We would all the pieces needed to be the same to kind of reach the economy of scale that we were trying to create. So one single unit, the unit is slightly flexible, and it's totally recyclable. But in a way, what the idea of being able to flex the unit or deform the unit allow for people to bend the rules of the system, right? You could actually deform it and take it different places. So this is a project as exhibited in different places. But this is kind of for me, the most interesting part. It's really when we open up the system for people to play with it. And it really kind of, perhaps it doesn't reach the kind of larger installation or the form of compositional aesthetic or beauty that we might want in a particular piece, but it really kind of engages in this kind of very organic form of growth and participatory design. In a way, every participation became a token. It became a form of denoting that I have been here, I have engaged with the project, and I wanted to leave something behind. We've also used the project in schools and in educational programs to really teach ideas of logic and math that are kind of very much embedded into the way the system operates. And many years later, I'm going to show you a second project. This is a project that I haven't really published too much about, but it really kind of follows the lineage of the Bloom project. The Bloom project was one of the first projects that I started working on with these ideas, but I've been wanting to take these ideas much more into the built environment and architectural environment. So the project, I've been calling it the combinatorial nest, and it looks at different joinery systems which are serially produced. As you can see here, I have a fascination with things that are serially produced because they're very cheap, right? You can buy this serially produced joinery for cents. I'm not interested in very expensive 3D printed or unaffordable units. I'm trying to figure out how do we create a very, very inexpensive geometry, and this is something that we came up with. This is the joint that we designed, and it basically connects standardized timber, in this case. So we could serialize the units, again, very cheap, and we could connect timber to these joints, right? And the only thing that these joints would actually do is shift the orientation of the timber. So the timber is standard, the joint is standard, but the joint would actually determine the orientation of the wood. And with that, we would have a combinatorial system, a system that you could actually change and use permutations and design by the organization of parts, not by expensive parts, right? So the parts become cheap, but what is interesting is the information that it's developed in the system. So we have a series of different joints. 2 or 3 should be enough to kind of create enough variety. And this is a small prototype, and it's a project that it's still ongoing, and we haven't really finished. This is kind of a first mock-up to see how it operates in its real scale. And it really grows it could grow in a very linear way, very kind of repetitive way if you want, but it can shift and rotate and have variation. So we've kind of been looking for funding opportunities, submitting this project to different funding options. And in a way, we always envision this project as something that it's not a final form, but rather a system that could take different shapes depending on the environment. These are images that we submitted for the Tallinn Biennial in this year, and we got a 3rd prize for this proposal. And we really wanted to work within a very tight budget. Again, everything is standard. The timber is something that you can find in every construction shop. And when we present a model of the project, we don't really give you the final form. We don't give you a 3D print of the final piece because the piece is quite open-ended, right? So we submitted a project that was a kit of parts, a toy, that you could actually organize in many different ways. And in order to organize it, we give you also the instruction set. We give you the blueprints, if you want, of how to put it together, right? What are the different options? How could you organize the joints and basically create different things? So this is the instruction set that comes with the pieces. And this puts a lot of emphasis that information, something that it's in a way much more inexpensive and easier to transmit, carries the value of the piece. The piece is very cheap, but the value comes from the organization of the parts. So this is kind of the small toy version. And I really like the idea of having a toy version of a project and a large-scale version of it. This toy becomes a simulation. It's a form of game. It's a physical game that really becomes scaled up to a real life-scale installation. So just to kind of summarize a little bit the idea of discrete architecture and why that is important. For me, discrete architecture creates a framework where parts could be inexpensive, they could be approachable, and they could be participatory, right? It creates a form of parallelism where people can develop competition and cooperation, having different pockets, as we saw initially. There's encapsulation, the idea that there's a lot of knowledge put into the pieces, right? The pieces already contain some form of pre-engineering, if you want. And then the organization of those pieces is something playful. It's something that could happen more spontaneously in the hands of a crowd. And I like the idea of exaptation, which is a term that suggests that you could take ideas from one context and put them somewhere else, right? It's a term that comes from biology, where you can, maybe a gene kind of performs in a particular way in this context, but you can move it to a different context, and it acquires a different kind of connotation. And I think that happens when you have this kind of combinatorial strategy of design. So with these ideas in mind, we have the idea of discrete architecture as a framework. That's the first chapter. I start thinking, well, what about these patterns, right? How do these patterns emerge? And I thought with the Bloom project, sure, we have gameplay, right? People can play and organize these patterns themselves. But that could happen in a much more global scale. And I started moving towards digital work. My reflection on patterns starts with the idea that traditional architecture, or even avant-garde architecture, as far as I know, operates under this paradigm, which is you have a form and we break that form down into pieces, right? And that, for me, it's a jigsaw puzzle, right? All the pieces belong to a whole, but they play one unique role. And I wanted to think that we could subvert that model, right? How do we create an open whole, something that it's open-ended, where the pieces do not need to play one unique role, but they could actually play a multiplicity of roles. And I started looking at examples. There was in 1966, this is the Brown Electron kit, that it was very inspirational to this idea of how parts do not need to conform to one totality, but rather they kind of organize themselves in, or potentially could organize themselves in many different ways. This is the Brown Electron kit as it's presented to a player, right, or a kid. And it suggests that there's many multiple patterns or organizations that you could create. And some of them might become a radio, some of them might become a different kind of device, right? And for me, these two models, a holistic kind of a totality that could be broken into parts, that seems to be the paradigm of design that I seem to see every day, or the way in which we practice architecture today. I'm trying to move towards this non-holistic kind of framework where the kit of parts could really offer a multiplicity of opportunities, right? So when we're developing patterns, the organization of these parts, we really are not trying to dictate that one pattern is better than another one, right? But they're rather they could be contingent and idiosyncratic, meaning that they acquire value specifically by the people engaging with them, right? So the architect or the designer here is not saying, well, this is what should happen, where let's say, participatory or people would actually become labor for a system, but rather people give value to the system, right? So there's a few characteristics which I think that I'm trying to put forward with this idea of combinatorial design. I think I mentioned some of this, which is affordable mean of production, and the differentiation, the design happens at the level of the patterns. So I decided to start exploring and researching how this could happen digitally, right? I really wanted to have more people than just people that would have access, physical access to the parts, to engage with this with these elements. So I started developing video games, basically thinking that whatever I'm simulating in a digital environment, that could be open up to a much larger social system, right? And in a way that's a video game. And I had personal interest in video games. I always thought of them as an expressive medium that what was really kind of getting to a level of maturity where this kind of idea of participation could actually be engaged as in a serious kind of practice. So this is one of the first video game projects that I developed together with students in the Bartlett School of Architecture in London, which is, and this is literally the first time when we started exploring game engines like Unity and using them to simulate a kind of architecture, but also thinking of systems, in this case, that would extract water or would desalinate water. How do you create ecological relations between units? How do you transfer data or information throughout a system? This is a different project. Again, this is a small studio that we did throughout a year in 2013 that was really looking at very different examples of how the interaction of players and users would have a say in the way in which we design architecture. And in this case, we were kind of conceiving of a robotic frame that would kind of behave and interact depending on a series of behaviors that could be programmed into the set, right? So this was an environment not only to design the robot, but also to design the behaviors or the emotions that the robot would actually be able to transfer in relation to humans. And finally, there was this piece as well called the Wireflies, which was one of the first projects that I developed, influenced by things like Minecraft and projects that have been in the public sphere of games, but really expanding on how do you transfer electricity, how do you transfer or capture energy, and how that could become part of the architecture fabric within a speculative form of architecture. So these projects never became a public game, something that we would share online with the public. They were really kind of prototypes. But I realized that in order to really test out some of the thesis that video games could become a vehicle to the organization of patterns, the organization of or allow design by non-experts, I needed to develop a professional video game that would do so. So I kind of started working on a project that I call Blockhood. And this is a project that started in 2014 in a conference in Hong Kong. And initially, you can see some of the images here, the very, very rough prototype of the game that we did for that conference. We worked like maybe 2 months to put together this little kind of demonstration of what this game could be. And it was very, very crude, very simple. And it was called Block at the time. And once this conference finished, I decided to kind of take the project further and really develop it professionally for the next 3 years. The project is certainly inspired by the extreme density of the city of Hong Kong that operates almost as a three-dimensional grid, right? It's this kind of very dense three-dimensional environment. And today, Blockhood, after 3 years of development, it really has reached its final form. It has over 100,000 players worldwide. It has been translated into 11 different languages, and we kind of try to always offer free educational licenses to expand the outreach of the project, right? The project has three main mechanics, if you want, or three main ideas that are kind of encapsulated into it. The game engages with ecology, with entropy, and coexistence. And I'm going to break down those three as I kind of show you a bit more, right? The game really tries to kind of reflect on our lack of awareness and like what is the impact that we have on the environment? It's like how far do the systems that we engage with go? How do we dispose of waste and so on? And it's also very influenced by a particular initiative called The Plant in Chicago, which is an urban farming facility that uses a series of it uses an ecological system to administrate waste. So basically everything that is waste from one production entity becomes the input of another one, right? So if plants produce some form of residue, that becomes the input for the fish, and the fish will produce some form of output that will become input for an anaerobic digester, for instance, and everything is kind of a pattern of circularity, right? So the minimization of waste, it was perhaps the central idea here. Finally, the final kind of observation or kind of influence, again, going back to Bucky Fuller and his participation with the Whole Earth Catalog, I was very influenced at the idea of the Whole Earth Catalog as a publication that happened in the 60s, where different architects and designers were sharing blueprints of something that you could do with your own hands. And for a long time, I kept on thinking, what would be the contemporary version of such a catalog? What would be, if we have to do a catalog again, which some people have tried, like Kevin Kelly did a version of this catalog, a contemporary version. But my idea of how this catalog would become part of the 21st century, it wasn't really about updating the technologies that we have available, but rather would be to simulate, to create a video game where you would be able to play and test out how these technologies would actually be combined with one another. So throughout the development of 3 years, the game evolved. It went from a series of units, building blocks, that you could actually just play in this small representation of a city block. But it really wanted to challenge the player to think of a small neighborhood. It was a diagram of a city, right? Like where you couldn't just create, waste wouldn't go anywhere else. You would need to manage waste within your city block. You needed to deal with the production of energy within your city block. You needed to deal with the coexistence between animals and humans within your city block. So it became like a thought experiment. How does it look, a city block, once you are kind of forcing a player to think of all these ecological relationships that are often thought as something that you could send out. Let's say you could send waste somewhere else. But what if you would have to deal with all these things, right? So the first idea of the game, and the idea of ecology that I mentioned earlier, had to do with that each unit in the game, it's a computational unit. It produces an output, right? So a tree would create oxygen, but at the same time would have an input. It would need water. So every unit in the game has an interdependence with other units in the game, right? So a player could actually create anything they want. They could actually just very quickly build something quite large. But if those inputs and outputs are not met, the building will slowly decay and die, right? So this is the idea of entropy, which is the second point. Nothing remains alive, nothing remains healthy if you don't maintain them alive and healthy, right? So you're kind of engaging with this circularity, this kind of interdependence of units, but you're actually having to maintain an ecological balance between them. Finally, the idea of coexistence is that you're not really defining a neighborhood for humans, but rather there's a multiplicity of different characters in the game, meaning some of them are humans, some of them are animals and different species and so on. And you're always trying to kind of maintain, you can see how happy or how kind of satisfied they are from the different conditions that you're offering, right? So at any point, you need to kind of be creating synergies between different simulated agents, right? So it's really reflecting on the coexistence of different groups. The game doesn't really force you to think of a city block as something that is urban. You could perfectly design a landscape, right? So without any humans whatsoever. So there's no distinction between artificial and natural environment, right? They both operate under the same assumption that there's an interdependence of values or currencies that are transferred between the different units. I'm showing you here some images and some videos of the game as we usually share it in PC and in a computer, but also we develop a version that it's in virtual reality. So if you're interested to access that, I'm happy to offer, get in touch. I can send you a copy of the game so that you can try it. And in a way, for me, the difference between virtual reality and a PC game, it's really how big the screen wraps around your head. But the most interesting thing to me, it's not the format. It's more how do you reach more people? How do you engage people with the narrative of the game? This is kind of the diagram of how the game works, right? Like there's a unit, and that unit transfer resources to another one, and there's this kind of sense of interdependence between them. There's a series of other rules that are kind of overlapped over that. First rule of interdependence that has to do with synergies or things that kind of work well together. And players have spent a lot of time trying to figure out all the positive and negative synergies that the game offers, right? This is an image of a neighborhood that has been broken, that has been destroyed, because as you play and you do not maintain an ecological interdependence between the parts, and the game slowly decays and dies. Right? Again, images of like production of natural environments without humans, perhaps. And one of the things that the game can do at the moment, and this is where I was very interested to test if this was possible, it really doesn't give the player a biased simulation where you can say, well, the organic food system, it's better than the industrial food system, right? You could play in different ways, right? You could play it and create organic farms, or you can play it and create kind of industrial farms. And both of them have positive and negative consequences, right? They have different timing, they have different scales, they have different yield. So it's up to you as a player to realize what is the impact of each one of those systems. There's a decision-making process, right? And I think that games often make this point very clear. It's about you deciding. The politics are more difficult, as many would argue, than the actual implementation of technology, right? The game really thinks that we have all these urban currencies, right? Money and capital is not the only currency that we consider. And the game really tries to capture a series of kind of non-formal forms of currency. So one of the big challenges that we had as a team is how do we convert something like calories or water, that is something very tangible, into something like community or social social qualities or education or things that are very difficult to quantify. So the game really tries to create some form of ratio or conversion, if you want, between these different currencies. At any given point, a player is invited to look at the game through different lenses, right? You can look at it through the production, right? You can look at it, what is actually producing resources, what is not. Red is here, what is not producing resources. You could see how much decay is happening, right? Like units have an information that is resilient, like how much can they resist before they break, right? And you can see that some of the pink units are starting to decay while the red ones are about to decay, and until they actually decay, right? There's also layers of structure, right? How do architecturally we consider something that stands, even though this is a very simple calculation, and also notions of circulation, right? Like how do people navigate? How do they move around? And we would have continued with more and more layers, but it felt that at this point, these layers were enough complexity for a player to handle and have to take decisions that were meaningful. This is some of the This is one of my favorite slides in a way, because it shows what players have done online to share information with one another. They have this kind of open Google Docs, and they kind of share how to play the game. There's tutorials that people do to each other, and they're teaching each other how to kind of improve and beat the game in better ways, right? How do you create patterns and organizations that are more effective? Again, some images of how the game works. So for me in architecture, this video game really started suggesting or hinting that we could think of a form of parallel emergent urbanism, right? Where many different communities enabled by, in this case, a video game, could actually simulate their own local, context, their own kind of hyper-local situation, right? As opposed to a form of master planning that would define cities as a large canvas, and there would be like this kind of top-down approach to define what happens and what does not, right? So I really wanted to think that video games could become a form of infrastructure for the development of content and ideas for architecture in the hands of users. So the game doesn't really tell you there's one correct solution, right? There's always conflicting criteria. You're not going to be able to find one solution that beats all the other solutions, right? And this puts a lot of emphasis that there's recipes or patterns and value systems that come from local environments, right? They're not developed or defined by me, in this case, the programmer, but rather they're actually coming from within the communities that use them, right? So I kind of spend a lot of time making sure that I'm removing my own interests from the game, right? How to make a simulation non-biased, right? And I think that that's a larger conversation, and I think that maybe it's not possible. There's always going to be some bias, and we can embrace that in many different ways. But I always thought that having conflicting criteria would force the players to take decisions and define what do they care about, right? So this is what the game wants to do, create this form of insight that happens at the level of the player. That's level 1. But level 2 is how do you propagate knowledge between the players. If the game could become a way of passing ideas between players about what things could happen in a community, that would be the great success. And I think it hasn't happened, so I'm still working on projects that attempt to do such a thing, right? So in a way, there was a political reflection here, in that we don't, as architects, we cannot just wait and vote on the candidates that we care about, but rather we need to kind of engage on the production of systems that are aligned with our policies, right? Like in this case, if the production of social values was important, I couldn't do that by applying to competitions and kind of putting my free labor into the market, but rather how do we kind of create systems that make participatory and engage with crowds? So with that, this is kind of my most recent completed project, and I'm going to show you one project that is what I'm working on right now, which hasn't been released officially yet. And with that, I want to reflect on the idea of the commons, which is central to my work and central to all my writing as well. So today we seem to be looking or living through what many would argue it's a form of platform capitalism, right? Platforms have become central to the manipulation of information. Things like Facebook and YouTube and a myriad of other platforms have become the central social hubs for communication in the era of network technologies. But we are facing a kind of a large problem, a big problem in how do we manipulate or how do we legislate and how do we work around these platforms, understanding that there's a kind of a great power in these platforms to extract value, extract data, and they create kind of a asymmetric playing field between players, between users, if you want, on one hand, and the platform manager, right? So as someone that is engaging with the production of video games and digital platforms, this was something that started becoming incredibly important for me and something that I wanted to reflect upon. Especially when we see cases like in the US, there was the whistleblower, Christopher Wiley, who exposed how Cambridge Analytica had been extracting data from users in order for manipulating the election, right? So the power of platforms was something that needed to be considered. And today, Shoshana Zuboff has written a really incredible book, Surveillance Capitalism, which really defines kind of the new rise of totalitarianism through platform infrastructure. And it's something that we definitely should engage, I think, if you're designing or thinking of platforms as a medium. The interesting thing is that there's been a lot of thinkers and a lot of technologies that have put forward solutions or perhaps antidotes to some of the challenges that platforms are putting forward. For instance, Julian Assange has been using or putting forward the idea of cryptography as a kind of a form of non-violent direct action where a user can protect themselves from the extractive power of platforms. And there's all sorts of problems also associated with authorship and accrediting the production of value. In the case of Pinterest, for instance, you could have a board like this if you're an architect, and maybe you love the images, how they look together, but there's almost kind of a sense of there's a lack of authorship or information that put back the value on content creators. So the argument of provenance, where this information is created and how it's propagated into a network, is something that many technologists have reflected upon. And I here refer to Ted Nelson's work with the Xanadu and his own data structures. What he's doing here is really trying to create a data structure that saves or kind of keeps the information of who originated data, right? And Jaron Lanier has made a huge argument about this. If we are producing data, we should be owners of our own data. We should be able to engage on how that data is being used later down the line. And he would argue that you would have to be paid if that data is used. Some would disagree with that. I kind of stand behind more of the taxation or basically having more rights on the appropriation of that data. Other forms of alternatives seem to be different kind of license agreements, right? Like the idea behind the Creative Commons license, particularly the idea of like share alike or remixing ideas, suggests that content could be remixed, reorganized by others, and there needs to be a kind of a particular agreement, a transaction that is pre-established by a license in a way. And finally, the idea of how do we develop platforms for cooperation, right? And this is ultimately the big counterpoint, if you want, to the subversive or more totalitarian power of platforms, right? So platforms could be used as we see them today for the extraction of value from their users. And I want to sit on the kind of creative side. People like Trevor Schultz have been arguing that we should really think of a form of platform cooperativism. How do these platforms enable social participation and the cooperation between users in a network, right? So we do have challenges. We have big challenges that have been visible today in the kind of proliferation of large platforms like Facebook, Google, and so on. But also we've seen that there's a series of responses, right? Encryption, provenance tracking, cooperatives, and different licensing agreements. So there seems to be some momentum of how do we do better platforms? How do we design platforms that are more ethical, right? In architecture and design, I would say we don't have too many platforms. In particular, in architecture, I would say we don't have any kind of robust platforms. There's no such thing as a kind of a Facebook for architecture. And the closest thing I've seen are things like 3D Warehouse. Recently, there's been something called Modelo.io, which are trying to create dashboards where you can share information regarding architecture. But these are not really having the impact that things like YouTube had for the video industry. At the same time, there seems to be projects that could heavily use a platform, right? We have the WikiHouse by Alastair Parvin, which is a project that I really love. And they're developing their own kind of software platform for sharing and propagating the open source ideas behind WikiHouse. There's also the Open Building Institute from Marcin Jakubowski and Karolina Mota. And they also, but both of these projects use GitHub as a generic form of information sharing and versioning control. So I think that there's something else to be done, specifically when you're engaging with 3D form and the production of architecture. And again, I look at video games. This is images from The Sims. And it seems to me that video games are very well equipped for the production and the proliferation of, content, 3D content and information that is spatial, right? And players are already operating in this form of knowledge propagation. If you look at the community behind games like The Sims, there's an incredible momentum of players sharing recipes, sharing constructions, sharing videos, and modding the game, altering the game structure in order to do things that they want, right? So I decided to kind of engage with a new project, Commonhood. It's been my most recent video game project that tries to think of an architectural platform, a design platform that puts emphasis on some of the ethical conditions that I consider that need to be addressed by a platform, but also how do we kind of think of architecture through the lens of some of the ecological and social challenges of today, right? So the game presents two modes. It gives you a story mode that really kind of follows a character through a story of an eviction and how do you live at the edge of homelessness, almost kind of a story that has to do with the inequality that we are kind of facing today. And another one, which is a sandbox mode, which you're really kind of building a business if you want. But it's heavily mediated. It's allowing you to design architecture, but it's mediating that architecture through your scarcity of knowledge, resources, and labor. So when we look at design software, we seem to think that these are non-biased. You can actually do whatever you want, and there's softwares that are not biased by what they allow you to do. But I would say that all softwares are very biased. They're very much telling you, this is the little playground that you can work on, and you cannot go outside that playground. That is represented in the tools that you are offered, but it's also represented in the tools that you're not offered, right? So there's a demarcation of what you should do. The difference between a software and a video game is that a video game makes that bias evident, right? The video game will tell you you're a character and this is the role that you're playing. So they're making very evident the bias. But in a way, every software has this bias in one way or another. So I'm putting forward a video game, this game, Commonhood, that has a bias towards the idea of scarcity, right? The lack of resources. And those resources could be material, they could be informational, they could be time, and they could be labor, right? It could be the security of your workers. What are the labor conditions, right? And all these variables really play a role in the way you design architecture, the way you design shelter, the way you increase the value or the living conditions of your community, right? In a way, I'm going to let this video roll, which is a bit long. We're trying to create an environment, which is a modeling environment, that it kind of places less emphasis on the nature of form. That seems to be the current metric of progress in the architectural discourse, right? And mediate that form by a whole series of other layers, right? Some of the big challenges that the game is facing today, as we are designing it, is like how do we share knowledge? How do we share spatial knowledge? How do we go from one player to another one? And we've created a series of systems that I'm going to explain to you in a second that really put a lot of emphasis on not only what you can do, but how do you share that with someone else, right? The game is operating under an idea of modularity and recombination of parts that I've been explaining before. So it really kind of uses the framework of this grid architecture in one way or another to kind of allow for a modeling environment where knowledge propagation at the center of the piece, right? As you can see here, these characters are building different things. You don't have a copy-paste in the game, right? So some things that you're kind of very familiar in other softwares, you can copy-paste. And copy-paste seems to be one of those technologies that is fundamentally funded on the notion of abundance, right? You can make something out of nothing. So copy-pasting is kind of, it has certain ideologies behind it. In commonhood, copy-pasting means that you need to acquire the resources, simulate the work, take the time to reproduce a particular unit, right? And you could either automate that through a machine, or you can actually have people using manual labor or simulated manual labor to do so, right? So it really places more emphasis on what are the constraints associated with our designs, and it tells a lot more of the challenges that we'll face in doing these designs. So my argument here is that designs can change or will change if we are considering some of these things as we are engaging with them, right? They would perhaps put more emphasis on the ethical labor practices, or would actually in the use of materials, right? And those value systems or those issues that might arise from the game, they're also local to each community. A community might have a great access to technology, but might have not so much access to machine labor or human labor, right? So those codes change from whoever's engaging with the game. And you're seeing some images here as well that are kind of mixing the story mode of the game with the kind of creation mode of the game. And so I cannot go deeper into the story because it's something that is still in the making, but the only thing that I can share with you right now is that it really tries to engage with very contemporary narratives, issues that have been happening in Argentina and in many other places in the world, where the kind of idea of progress represented in large corporations, large factories, have been left behind, have been collapsed, and you are a member of a community that is starting to squat a building, to start to occupy a building illegally, and basically reconstruct a new economy from within, considering or challenging you in a way not to fall into the same problems that kind of made that company collapse in the past, right? So there's kind of some idea that we're kind of living through a new cycle, if you want, where there was a great deal of technological progress, or kind of envisioning that this would actually lead us to some form of prosperity, and how that failed, and how are we reflecting on this circularity. So just a few more images regarding these ideas. These are kind of the different layers of scarcity that you engage with, right? Material access, access to tools, access to knowledge, access to labor, right? Scarcity meaning you don't have access to them, right? Like most of the time you will struggle to get access to these attributes, right? And some of the features of the game have to do with the workshop management. How do you kind of operate, managing space, managing tools, right? So you cannot, imagine you have a modeling engine and you cannot draw lines unless you have the machine that would allow you to create those lines, right? So you're dependent on the machinery or the labor in order to think of ideas in a way. It's kind of thinking that ideas are much more intertwined with their kind of material possibility. One of the things that I think is quite interesting is that we are not saving geometry. The game doesn't save geometry, but rather saves player actions, right? So when we're shifting the idea in architecture is that instead of saving a mesh or a piece of geometry that could be transferred as a file, you're sharing a series of a player action, a way in which a player has taken action in the game, right? And this allows us to really kind of look back and see, when you're looking at a much larger construction, there's been a series of authors, right? There's a series of people that participated on that project, right? So maybe you're using parts of someone else. Let's say I develop a staircase and I share that online. Someone else develops a wall. There seems to be kind of a form of collective authorship that emerges by having the information of all the users that participated. So we're kind of creating a form of ledger that collects this data from users, and we're giving credit and value to the players that are participating. The simulation of manual labor is often put in contrast to the challenge of automation. You will be able to buy a robot, acquire a robot, and perhaps not need to deal with manual labor at all. But it's your decision and to kind of see if that is efficiency, what you're going for, or is there other kind of human values that you're considering at the moment of taking that decision. Again, the idea of patterns, like in Lego, it's been critical to my work and always something I'm reflecting upon. So one of the technical things that we're doing in the game is that when you model, let's say, a panel, we don't give you the opportunity to rebuild that panel instantly, as I mentioned before, but rather the panel is an instruction. It's a series of steps of how do you create a new panel. So when you download the panel that someone else created, you're gonna instantly it becomes a tutorial. It teaches you it records the history of how that panel is built. So if every piece of geometry in the game is a tutorial for other players, we are kind of reinforcing the notion of knowledge propagation. How do we transfer the information or the knowledge from one player to another one? So these are kind of the ideas that are fundamentally defining how do we design the game and how do we move forward. And finally, the game wants to be a marketplace, one in which you could opt from different modes. You could subscribe to a form of open source or Creative Commons, and we'll give you incentives to do so. But someone might want to monetize their own production. And so we want to also give you different alternatives, different models, and those would have different repercussions. There's reputation systems that would be associated with creative, collaborative commons or Creative Commons content, and there's other kind of metrics that have to do with the production of monetized content. But we cannot impose a form of regulation. I really want to think of a platform that is far more democratic. We're thinking of ideas of how do we allow for elections where maybe players could change the rules of the game, or would suggest maybe different forms of taxation for like the collaboration between players. It really kind of allowing much more how players become a form of kind of citizen of a digital piece of infrastructure, as opposed to just a player that kind of belongs to the company's kind of projection. And ultimately, and this is just speculation, because this is currently not in the game, this is something that we're kind of testing as a prototype, how do we connect the idea of material production with projects like that I showed you before, the Componest? How do we kind of allow these platforms to become the place in which we simulate and envision pieces of architecture that could really become part of the built environment? So my objective is really to kind of use this software for allowing others to design their own kind of local forms of architecture, hopefully highly idiosyncratic and highly local, and allow for non-expert users to create architecture within these environments. The game really has subscribed to some of the protocols of Creative Commons, and we're really trying to make these different licensing agreements to be present within the game. And just looking ahead, as I mentioned, the game really wants to incentivize the construction of the commons. So how do we kind of create kind of infrastructure that is available for everyone, making architectural knowledge accessible and shareable, and emphasize on the dependencies, on the ecological dependencies and relationships of the things that are the actions that we take responsibility for those. And finally, is the fair recognition of labor, right? Like we cannot extract that labor as something that we want to profit from, but rather kind of give, a real reverence to the value that creators are putting forward. To finish, I would like to read a quote from Donna Haraway, which is someone obviously very influential for me. And it's really the idea of sympoiesis. And she says, sympoiesis is a simple word. It means making with. Nothing makes itself. Nothing is really autopoietic or self-organizing. So with that, I want to conclude, and I want to just invite you to check out. All these ideas that I've been putting forward here are part of a book that I'm writing. It's called The Architecture for the Commons, and it's coming out next year. So hopefully, if you're interested, you can check that out. Thank you.
So now, questions? You're welcome, but if you ask in Russian, please.
Thank you very much, Jose. It was very interesting lecture. I just heard about that. Actually, I have an idea that is very familiar with the name of the lecture. And I was thinking about it for 1 year already, and I would just like to share it with somebody here. I need to continue shortly in Russian. Если кому-то здесь интересно про...
If anybody is interested in what I'm going to talk about patterns, I've been thinking about this for a year. Let us gather together, maybe make something about this. We may have one gathering or call each other and then decide on whether we are going to do this. But what I'm going to think about is I'd like to meet people from architecture. I'm going to leave very soon, unfortunately.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for just that bringing all the people together. I hope that we will create something together. Я оставлю свой номер на
I will leave my phone number at the exit here. My idea is to build a house
построить дом в Москве.
A house in Moscow with...
Да, I'm sorry. Я просто оставлю номер, кому
I will leave my phone here. If you're interested, please take it and we'll get in touch.
Thank you for your talk. It was really amazing how you approach all the stuff of yours. I've got 2 questions. One is about Blockhood. The thing about Blockhood is, just have you thought about all the creations that people come up with to kind of like pit all the players, I don't know, against each other, if that makes sense? In the game, you just build the sector of something. You come up with the ecosystem and so on and so forth. But in the real world, the thing is that you don't have just one thing being alone. There are always all other factors around it, affecting it, including other people who do something or build something. So have you thought about it?
Yeah. So... yeah, I think in a way this is a really interesting question, and obviously as we start working on these projects, there's this ambition to really make all these ideas real, right? But I'm a very small team, and I obviously also, maybe this is a disappointing answer, but it's mediating my own capacity, technical, capital, to kind of engage with these ideas over time. So doing a video game, it's heavily influenced on also scoping, right? How big does the video game want to be? And that is, how much capital do you have? How much salaries can you pay to kind of work with the team, right? And so I feel like there's kind of a trajectory of something that we want to do, which is definitely what you're describing. It's like, how do you create much more like where online players can actually interact with one another, kind of create a kind of an ecosystem, if you want, where there's a kind of a push and pull relationship. But as a first game, Blockhood could not engage with those things. It was completely outside the scope of what we could do and we knew how to do. And so we decided to kind of put some of those ideas in the next game. So Commonhood started by developing a kind of an open, like a online marketplace. So the idea that as a player, you could actually create content and you could download someone else's content and you could create a contract. So you could say, hey, I want 20 chairs, right? I want a contract and maybe I don't have the time or the machines to do those 20 chairs. Someone else could create a contract for other players. So you would have this kind of push and pull relationship. So that's definitely what we're trying to do with Commonhood. But in a way, I feel like every game or every project can advance so much in order to do it well. And yeah, I would love to see this kind of circularity between, like, it really becomes a form of culture in a way, right?
I actually thought about this from that side of view, that just about injecting like some chaos in the system. I mean, because in a real world, there's always something going on that you cannot affect in any way. It's like a three-body problem or something like this. So is this injecting this kind of chaos, this kind of like unpredictability in the game, is this something you?
Well, I think that in my view, I mentioned a little bit about that in the sense that for me, humans are the first chaos that you bring in. So if you could simulate this environment just purely with mathematics, and it's going to be clean, it's going to be deterministic, and you might kind of calculate different outputs. But the moment that you put humans into the system, you have all sorts of crazy stuff going on, right? So the game wants to make certain things like, the looks, the aesthetics of the game. Some players might have different tendencies that you cannot predict that, right? Or they might I don't know, some people have done, references to popular culture, let's say Star Wars, right? References. And this happens a lot in Minecraft and things like that. So you're suddenly kind of intersecting kind of an ecological simulation that has a model that has, certain equations, a simple one, but yet one that seems to create its own series of codes. And that's intersected with the messiness of people's interests, people's desires, people, and I love that. I feel like that's super messy. And all the time I see creations that are kind of coming from all sorts of different angles. So I'm not saying that it's everything in a way. I feel like when players have to collaborate, it's kind of taking it to the next level, right? You're kind of multiplying that chaos if you want. And I have a kind of a strange relationship with this because some architects tell me, well, how do you tame the crowd? How do you make them do what you want to do? And I'm like, no, this is not what I want to do. I don't want to kind of impose my, ideas into the game. It's like, if anything, I want to remove myself from the game so that, there's local values emerging. And hopefully there's a multiplicity of different kind of collectives that might have different value systems, right? So I constantly think about this. I mean, but I don't know. I don't have a complete answer. In a way, you have to kind of belong to the communities engaging with the game and see how the game takes kind of life on its own. And I can only share with you that Blockhood hasn't been that yet, right? It has received some attention, enough attention to kind of keep this research going. But it's the bet is that at some point, some of these systems would kind of take a life of its own, and it's just going to be used by the community to kind of beyond the expected, intention from the design team. So, yeah, hopefully with more expertise in these systems, that could happen.
And the last question regarding Commonhood. I mean, the idea of the marketplace in which you're going to have players will have an ability to sell what they have either for free or for monetary, some kind of reward. It's as you said, that one of the key goals that you have is to give creators some kind of like attention they deserve. But this system as well can go very wrong. I mean, basically you're creating capitalism, like you're building it like from the ground up. And examples like YouTube, for example, show us that these systems are they can easily go very wrong. For example, if we go to the top of the top 10 channels, I mean, there are less and less creators who work alone, and more large media conglomerates that take advantage of the system.
Right.
So, also, did you give any thought about this?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly, I think, the big challenge. I mean, I want to get into that problem, right? I mean, these platforms that we have today, like YouTube, Reddit, and different ones, have been designed. Like Reddit was designed by, Aaron Schwartz, someone that had a very strong ideologies about the openness of information. So I think that it's not that every platform by definition would create capitalism, as you argue for. I think that Lauren Lessig has also been using video games. So how do we create different forms of interaction digitally and some of them might lead to kind of very kind of problematic practices. And I think that the more we engage on the design of these platforms, the more we can actually start kind of realizing what works, what doesn't, what alternatives. How do we create kind of cooperative value systems that maybe incentivize more the production of Creative Commons in this case, or value that is shared by individuals. So I very much think that this is the stage in a way to engage with some of these political problems, right? I don't think that by default technology would actually lead towards that. And I think that me trying to get into that space and figure out and report in a way what works, what doesn't. One of the things that I mentioned briefly, but maybe it's not clearly implemented, is that democracy needs to be part of this, right? Like, I don't think that I have the answers, and I'm not going to figure out how the system should operate, but like the more you embed democracy into the system, I think that if players would have a way to kind of also influence the policies, the privacy issues, right? Issues that are kind of arising as concerns, and in a way, the relationship between users and developers is a lot more symbiotic. I think that could lead towards interesting codes of culture, right? As opposed to say, I'm going to get it right because I have more kind of integrity than, someone else, right? I think that they need to start incorporating, like in a way, we live in these kind of dictatorial platforms, right? That do not open their policies to users at all. So I think that could change. But we'll see. I mean, I want to engage with that design.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And where can we find your processing tutorial?
Where can you find my processing tutorials?
Yeah.
So my website, it's plethoraproject.com. It's there. You go to education, and those processing tutorials are still there. I have them in YouTube and in Vimeo. That's where I always recommend to students that want to learn programming. That's where I learned. Then I moved to Unity, where I do video games. And I wish I was talking this with a few friends here in Moscow. I really want to go back to that and kind of start putting more content. In a way, I feel like the video content that I started doing in 2011 mutated and became my video games. So my video games, in a way, have a lot of more of my ideas, and they are also very educational, if you want. So I think that when you play a video game, they're not the most fun video games. Blockhood, if you play Blockhood, it's not really fun. It's actually, you start playing, it's like, oh, this is kind of difficult. You have to kind of keep track of a lot of things. But hopefully they make an argument. And it's an argument that it's not like in a video tutorial, you explain something, something works, and, it's a piece of technology. In a way, the video game tries to make an argument that it's a lot more speculative. It's trying to be like, I haven't resolved this issue. I have questions more than answers, right? So I feel like there's kind of a transition from moving from content that was very much explanation or this is how things work to more questions, right? Like, these are how I see moving parts in the city, moving parts with ecology, moving parts with the economy, and what kind of solutions can we find within that space, right? So I definitely see my work, this kind of transition, right? So I would connect perfectly the tutorials to these games, because they seem to be part of an ongoing interest to ask questions to a public or kind of engage with the community. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your lecture. I just wanted to ask about your offline projects. So, judging by your experience, would you say that a community needs a kind of a host to moderate it, or does it manage to organize its members organically in a way?
Yeah, you mean offline or?
Yes, offline projects. I mean, like the installation
Right.
with the parts. Yeah.
I think wherever I've seen it, both online and offline, is that there's always, kind of little group leaders at different scales. In Bloom, for instance, whoever would just kind of make a group of people would instantly be able to kind of engage with the game in a different way, right? If you had a group and you would be able to coordinate yourself in some way or another, and learn and kind of copy other people's, knowledge, you would actually get a lot more done. Like figuring out structure. Like Bloom, the interesting thing about Bloom is that it almost plays the opposite than Jenga. I don't know if you're familiar with Jenga, this game where you remove pieces and it falls apart. So Bloom, you add pieces and you keep going up, and at some point it falls apart, right? So the challenge is always about how do we make something that is stable, something that is structural, something that, that we can inhabit, right? And some of these challenges come from the community. The pieces are not telling you, hey, build something structural. Like there's no recipes, or there's no kind of rule system, right? But the moment that you have a group, the moment that you create these kind of micro leaderships, or you start talking to each other, you set up a challenge, and we see that over and over again, and that could become quite large in the sense. And I do think that we tend to think that architects operate professionally in the building of architecture, and then when we talk about the do-it-yourself, the DIY communities, these are non-architects. So there's the architects and the non-architects. I almost feel like architects should become, members, small kind of local leaders in a way of this very process that you're like, in a way, moderators of what's happening, right? So you work with the community. I mean, many times I was playing with kids and kind of suggesting something, those rules would be changed or suggested in a different way. So I don't think that I just operate at the scale of the programmer and, the alienated, programmer that is kind of far detached from the community, but rather really kind of getting in there, just playing the game, being part of the production of value within that model. I think that it's as important as kind of thinking on the rules of the system. Gaming in particular has this beautiful culture of modding, right, where there's the possibility of altering games, and community members take leadership and decide that they want to just expand the game beyond what the developer had originally intended. And I think that that's also the emergence of leadership within communities, and that's essential, right? That it's not all kind of centralized, but it really starts kind of propagated at different scales. So.
Thank you. Can I ask one more question? Maybe a stupid one. Is there a chance that players could use the blueprints from the Common Hood in real life? So like use those blueprints to build something in real world?
We're trying to make it so, yeah. Because we're using it's first of all, it's to scale. So we're using kind of material sizes that are accurate to the real world. Obviously, we don't have a very strong physics system. So right now, our geometries are very simple, right? They're very orthogonal. As a modeling tool, it's a pretty basic one. But if you have wood, timber, you could totally do realistic plans for architecture. So I'm very interested. The game will launch with several blueprints that will hopefully be totally materializable, meaning we want to do a tiny house. In the US, there's a kind of an interesting movement of the tiny house movement that is precisely people that cannot pay rent, or they want to reduce their payment of rent because of like student loans and things like that. And a lot of have moved towards the creation of their own tiny houses. They're kind of mobile homes where you don't have a piece of land, so you put it on wheels and you park it in different locations. So we want to connect this idea of inequality, the idea of that the story of the game will teach you how to do a tiny house, and that's going to be a blueprint that we want to collaborate with, build it, really kind of have a physical version of that. So if people know this is something that I could just physically build, maybe I would modify it, tinker with it, expand upon it. And it becomes this kind of open source, and you probably end up with hundreds of versions of tiny houses or stationary and permanent houses, right, that come from the blueprints that you could do in the game. For me, that would be the first success of the game, where it really starts kind of offering simple DIY solutions. It's a way of sharing, like the whole Earth catalog did back in the 60s. It's like allowing for the propagation of kind of open source architectural floor plans, if you want, right, in the form of a video game, which seems to be a kind of a medium far more approachable to a kid or someone that it's, doesn't have architectural education. I don't want to share blueprints of architecture because it doesn't mean anything for someone that hasn't been trained as an architect. But if a video game would teach you like a step-by-step tutorial, maybe you can just, learn how to build a chair or build how to do a table or make your own kind of house, or who knows, right? I think that this is the way in which I see these games to become infrastructure for the production of communities' own value.
Okay. Thank you so much, and good luck with the game.
Thank you.
Another question about Blockhood. Actually, as far as I remember, you published the game through Devolver Digital, right?
Yes.
So how did that happen? Because, I mean, Devolver is usually the publisher that publishes like huge, bombastic, like over-the-top games, and then all of a sudden they work with something that is actually very serious, very structural, and very game about simulating the city block.
Right. Well, there's a lot of nothing is as kind of clear cut as it might be looked from the outside. Devolver, yes, they have a portfolio of really gory, kind of nonsensical games, and I always think I'm a bit of their karma. Like I kind of represent the kind of project that kind of creates a kind of counterpoint to the rest of the portfolio. But Devolver was an opportunity for us to really engage with gaming culture in a very serious way, right? We got an article in The Guardian that showed Blockhood as some of the most anticipated games of 2016, and we were totally not expecting it. Like, that came out of nowhere. And it was like, I think it was The Last Guardian, then Blockhood, and I was like, oh my God, this is like not at the scale of what we were thinking. And we got a phone call from Devolver and a few other publishers that offered us publishing deal. And publishing deal for us meant you're not going to be just a tiny indie game that nobody would kind of look at, but rather you would have the opportunity to reach a kind of a mainstream audience. So we kind of took that opportunity, not because we liked the message that Devolver was giving us, but it was really kind of to co-opt the mainstream media of games and put forward the ideas that we had complete independent freedom. Like, Devolver did not have any editorial, say on what we were doing. So we felt free to kind of use their kind of outreach, their marketing power, their audience to kind of put in different ideas in the table. And I think that the relative success that we got, the 100,000 users, is not big for a game, but that number was enough for the game to kind of test some of the ideas and fund also Commonhood. So Commonhood has been completely funded from what Blockhood made in terms of, and it has been able to kind of pay the salaries of the people that work in the company, right? It really is not a project that tries to kind of create revenue or create profits, but rather kind of it's a research mechanism. I'm better at writing code than I'm writing grants, in a way, I always say. So I rather spend time, writing these video games that kind of have a potential commercial impact, but in a way that funds further research. So I don't think we're going to do, I don't know, we're kind of still looking for a publisher for the next game, Commonhood. And it's difficult because the moment that you're kind of asking for resources and support, people want to, ask you to change the game and have more input on how the game should be and have more commercial success. So we are kind of very hesitant to establish relationships with publishers or companies that want to direct the game in a different direction. We are kind of celebrating a lot, maintaining our independence. And if the game needs to take more time and have a very small team working on it to maintain that independence, that's what we're going to do, right? We're not going to, the game would be, for me, a betrayal if it really kind of sells the IPs or the ideas kind of are taken somewhere else. It wouldn't serve the purpose. And I'm not here in doing video games just to get rich or anything. I just want to kind of explore some of these ideas in that particular medium. So hopefully I'm not here several years from now and completely sold off on the matter. But I think that you have to, in order to engage the gaming culture as a large, collective, you definitely need to kind of get inside, work with the people that are doing these things professionally and kind of, what Sid Meier said, the creator of SimCity, of Civilization, he said you have to do this kind of stealth education, right? Where you're pretending not to be an educational game, but you're somehow infiltrating the ranks and kind of putting these ideas in the table. And I think that that's what Blockhood has done, and people that play it kind of seem to reflect that. You see the forums, there's kind of sometimes typical cases of people that hate certain aspects and love certain aspects, but then it's also conversations about how the city should be and what about density and what about ecology. And you're like, okay, there's some kind of reflection happening behind the scene. So I really enjoy that, and I hope to see a lot more of that.
Thank you.
Are there different environment or climate modes in any of your projects? Because some structures can or cannot operate under certain climate conditions, and do pay attention to the climate factor in your work in general.
Yes, but it's kind of quite surface level. I mean, a lot of I would be lying if I would say there's a kind of a very kind of complex, rigorous, let's say, climate study of how different climate conditions affect the performance of let's say, energy producing or crops and so on. But Blockhood does have a layer that simulates weather as something that it's probabilistic, meaning that it's not all, like you have day-night cycles, you have season cycles, and you have biomes, right? So you can play in, I think it's around 10 different biomes, and each biome affords different species, right? So every agent in the game, a human or an animal, appears spontaneously if the conditions that are right, in a way. You create the affordances for that species to emerge, right? So you basically are unlocking or discovering, I created the environment for, a worker or for a farmer to emerge because you created farms and you created certain conditions. And the same thing happens with animals. So certain animals cannot appear unless you're in a particular biome and have a specific condition. So the species that die very quickly in a particular biome, or some of them that kind of have a lot more resilience in a particular biome. So we definitely wanted to have the opportunity to play the game very differently if you are kind of in an alpine or in a kind of a tundra environment, right? And that, so there's coefficients. Each unit has specific coefficients to weather or kind of biome conditions. But I guess that this is kind of a very surface level. It's kind of to tell the player, yeah, these value systems change. I mean, something that was very scarce in one environment might be very abundant in another one. And depending in that environment, maybe you want to do more of this or more of that. It changes based on local properties, right? But again, I think that I started Blockhood thinking that I could actually simulate an urban city block almost realistically. And I realized that was a lot more difficult than what I thought, right? That I would actually have a kind of a one-to-one correlation with real systems. And I think it became much more of this diagram of how a city block could reflect on how do you internalize resources. So some architects have told me, like, why don't you do more kind of accurate simulations of solar, radiation or kind of sustainability issues in architecture. And I think that maybe down the line, maybe if the communities kind of, that play the game are kind of up to speed and kind of acquire the knowledge to kind of, with this system, maybe there's a chance to kind of make it more accurate and more complex. But right now, the point that the game is trying to make is far more conceptual and diagrammatic about the interdependence of things, right? So I don't discard the possibility of doing that in the future, but it also needs to be engaging and needs to kind of be able to communicate a message. So sometimes games need to kind of reduce the level of complexity in order to do that. And people like Will Wright, the creator of SimCity, has written and talked about this problem, which I see it as a very real thing, right? How complex we create a system maybe has a direct impact of how many people play it. So do you want to have a super accurate system that only a few people play, or do you want to have a very inaccurate system that millions of people play? And I think that there's somewhere in between. It's kind of the ideal scenario where you can get closer to reality, but not, to the point in which only experts can play it, right? So yeah, that's how I reflect on that matter. And it's always kind of a question mark. What is the right solution?
Thank you.